What if the first time the world laid eyes on Prince Archie, it wasn't a baby they were looking at, not a newborn, not even a child, but something else entirely? It sounds absurd, doesn't it? A conspiracy too far, too strange, too cruel to even say out loud. But this isn't a theory spun out of nowhere. It's not a wild Reddit thread, and it's not gossip from a tabloid. This comes from someone who has stood just feet away from royal history for over 4 decades. A man who has seen princes born, monarchs crowned, weddings celebrated, scandals whispered in back corridors, and private moments most of us will never know about. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Arthur Edwards isn't a YouTuber or a royal watcher. He's the royal photographer, the guy behind the lens at nearly every major royal event since the 1970s. He's photographed Princess Diana as she shyly debuted her engagement ring. He captured Prince William in his christening gown. He stood behind the rope line as Charles whispered to Camilla before it was ever public. He's been there. And on May 8, 2019, Arthur Edwards was there again. But what he saw that day still bothers him. In fact, according to a recent off-the-cuff admission captured in a podcast interview, it never sat right with him at all. Not the atmosphere in the room. Not the silence. Not the way Harry and Meghan smiled as they cradled a tightly bundled baby that, in Arthur's words, never moved. Now, this isn't about attacking a family. This isn't about disrespecting children. It's about something bigger, because if this moment, this single, orchestrated photocall was in any way fabricated, it throws into question everything that followed. Why does that matter? Because May 2019 was supposed to be a fresh chapter. A healing moment for a fractured monarchy. Harry, once the rebellious prince, was now a father. Meghan, after months of press abuse and online scrutiny, was now a mother. And together, they stood in St. George's Hall, cameras flashing, telling the world they were proud, exhausted, and overjoyed. But there was one problem. Something didn't add up. Arthur wasn't the only one who felt it. If you watch the footage, not just once, but frame by frame, there's a stiffness to the moment. Not from the parents, from the bundle itself. The supposed royal baby, swaddled tightly, face barely visible, remains eerily still. Not a twitch, not a movement of the cheek, not even a subtle shift, like you'd expect from a newborn reacting to the lights, the crowd, or the sound of his father's voice. Now, we know not every baby cries on cue. Some sleep, some freeze up in unfamiliar environments. But Arthur, and others in the room, would later say it felt staged, too smooth, too rehearsed, too controlled. It's a moment that was watched live by millions around the globe, one of the most anticipated royal events of the year. And yet, years later, even the photographer who took the shot admits he's not convinced what he saw was what he was told. So what exactly did Arthur Edwards see that day? And what prompted him, a man known for his discretion and loyalty to the royal family, to start speaking up now? That's where things get complicated. Because behind the camera lenses and the smiling faces, there were whispers. Whispers inside the palace. Among the staff. Among the photographers who didn't get the right angles. Among senior royals who allegedly weren't even present to meet baby Archie in the days following his birth. There were rumors of sealed hospital records, missing logs, delayed documentation, and, perhaps strangest of all, murmurs about an object. Not a person, an object, a prop, someone allegedly called it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's pull back and ask something simple. Why would Harry and Meghan, global icons, well-loved by millions, freshly stepping into parenthood, choose to stage their baby's debut with anything less than their real child? Why would anyone do that? For privacy? For protection? Or was something else going on entirely? Because you have to remember, this was May 2019, just weeks after the couple had officially moved out of Kensington Palace. They had taken residence at Frogmore Cottage, separate from the Cambridges, with staff turnover happening quietly behind closed doors. And in the months leading up to Archie's birth, the public had already started to ask questions. Meghan's bump changed size dramatically in photographs. Her public appearance schedule was tightly controlled. And curiously, there were no photos of her going into labor. No hospital wing moments like Kate. No standing on the stairs. Just silence. Then, out of nowhere, came the announcement. The baby had arrived. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was born in the early hours of May 6th. But something was off even in the timing of that announcement. First, media were told Meghan was in labor. Then, hours later, it was revealed she had actually given birth earlier that day. Then later still, it emerged the birth had happened even earlier, around 5:26 a.m., and the palace only released that detail after journalists began to push back. The timeline felt manipulated, as if the public was being handled. Now, if you're a parent, or even if you're not, think about this. Wouldn't you remember the exact moment your child entered the world? Wouldn't that be burned into your memory? And wouldn't you want the world to celebrate it with you in honesty, not carefully staggered press releases? That's the thing. The contradictions started small, but they piled up. And by the time Arthur Edwards walked into St. George's Hall on May 8th, he had already been briefed. It would be a short photocall. No open questions. No candid shots. Meghan and Harry would make a brief appearance, speak for a minute or two, then walk out. Arthur took his place behind the velvet ropes, raised his camera, watched the Sussexes walk in, and the moment they held up that blanket, that perfectly wrapped, unnervingly still bundle, he says something shifted. I just didn't feel the usual energy, he said later in a quiet interview. Babies wriggle. They stretch. They blink. But this one didn't. Now, is that enough to accuse someone of deception? Of course not. But it is enough to ask questions, especially when other witnesses, staffers, reporters, and even fellow photographers began quietly voicing the same unease. And that unease only grew with time, because Archie's early months remained strangely undocumented. There were no follow-up family photos, no candid shots on palace lawns, no stolen glimpses of a nanny wheeling him to the car, nothing but heavily curated images released on official Sussex platforms, often with only a hand or the back of a head showing. Compare that to George, Charlotte, or Louis, all photographed multiple times within weeks of birth, all seen by extended family, all confirmed in public view. With Archie, the mystery only deepened. And through it all, Arthur Edwards kept his silence. Until now. So why now? Why speak after years of royal assignments, media discretion, and public neutrality? That's the question we'll be unpacking. Because Arthur's admission isn't just a personal reflection. It may be a breadcrumb, one that leads to something far stranger and more orchestrated than anyone suspected. But we're not going to reveal everything at once. In fact, if you're looking for a simple answer, for some quick gotcha moment, this probably isn't the story for you. Because this story isn't about shock. It's about patterns. It's about what gets missed when we trust the narrative at face value. It's about how silence can speak louder than denials. And it's about a moment, frozen in time, that might not have been real at all. Which brings us back to the photo. You've seen it. We've all seen it. Meghan glowing in white. Harry beaming. A tiny bundle, swaddled so tightly you can't see anything but a hint of a nose. But here's the thing. Zoom in. Go ahead. Zoom in to the highest resolution you can find. What do you notice? Because Arthur Edwards did exactly that. Not in 2019, but recently. With a different lens. With time. With space. With doubt. And what he noticed? Well, that's where everything begins to unravel. Because what he saw made him stop breathing for a moment. What he saw made him question his career's most cherished principles. And what he saw, that one tiny detail, buried in pixels, is what we'll reveal next. But first, let's go back to the moment when the flash went off and nothing moved. What does a seam even look like in a newborn's blanket? That's what Arthur Edwards kept asking himself, over and over, as he scrolled through the highest resolution version of that photo. The one that had been published on nearly every front page in the world. The one meant to signal joy, renewal, new life. He wasn't trying to be conspiratorial. That wasn't his nature. Arthur was, by his own admission, old school. He believed in the job, in respecting boundaries, in capturing moments, not inventing them. But that particular photo, something gnawed at him. Not just the stillness, or the way the bundle rested against Harry's arm with an almost mechanical firmness. No, it was something subtler. A horizontal line, barely noticeable, running across the fabric just beneath what appeared to be Archie's cheek. He hadn't noticed it before. No one had, really. Not in the lower-res versions. Not amid the distractions of that day. The smiles, the rushed press gaggle, the tight window of time. But once you saw it, You couldn't unsee it. It was too straight, too precise, like it had been stitched. And once you start seeing seams, you start noticing where the fabric ends, where it folds unnaturally, where the curve of a cheek doesn't soften into the shoulder the way a real infant's would, where the shadows fall in ways that make no sense if there were breath, blood, or even basic movement underneath. Arthur didn't say anything at first. How could he? The photo had already gone viral. Meghan and Harry were being praised. The press, for once, had shown restraint. Everyone was playing their part. But something in Arthur's gut told him that he hadn't just missed a better angle that day. He'd missed the story entirely. And that terrified him. Because if he had been that close, if he had stood just feet from the subjects and still come away with something that felt fake, then what else had he missed across his career? What else had been staged? He reached out, quietly, to one of his colleagues, another photographer who'd been in the room, someone he trusted, someone who had also covered hundreds of royal events. And the colleague, after a pause, said only this: "I remember thinking the air felt heavy, like everyone had agreed not to look too closely." That was all it took. Arthur began digging. He didn't want to accuse. He just wanted to understand. Why had they been limited to just 2 minutes of shooting time? Why were questions pre-submitted and ignored? Why was the baby swaddled so tightly in a temperature-controlled room? And why, after all this time, did none of the photos from that day feel alive? Let's rewind, just for a moment, to that exact scene. May 8th, 2019. St. George's Hall, Windsor Castle. The setting is unmistakably grand. Cream-colored walls, crimson carpet. Centuries of history. Arthur had photographed Diana there. He'd watched the Queen greet heads of state beneath that same chandelier. But that day, it felt sanitized. Meghan entered first, smiling wide, wearing a crisp white dress. Harry followed, his hand resting carefully under the bundle. There were maybe 10 people in the room, all vetted, all familiar. Arthur lifted his camera, adjusted for the light, and pressed the shutter. Click. Another. Click. The moment passed in less than a breath. Harry spoke briefly, said how amazing it was to have a baby, how proud he was of Meghan. His voice trembled slightly, maybe emotion, maybe nerves. Then Meghan leaned forward and whispered, "He's just been sleeping the whole time." Arthur's camera was still clicking, but his brain froze. He's just been sleeping the whole time. In theory, that's a normal newborn comment. But there was something in the way she said it. A kind of overemphasis. A statement meant to preempt a question no one had asked yet. And sure enough, Archie never stirred. Not once. Not even when Meghan gently adjusted the blanket. Not when Harry gestured toward the press. There was no eye movement. No mouth twitch. No flinch. Arthur, at the time, thought maybe the baby was just very still. But now, he wasn't so sure. Because the more he studied those photos, the more he noticed oddities. The angle of the head, for instance. It didn't fall naturally into Harry's elbow. It rested atop it, like a well-positioned pillow. The nose, too. It lacked the softness of a newborn's cartilage. It looked, well, fixed. And the shadow under the chin, it didn't quite behave like skin. He tried to dismiss it. Chalked it up to lighting. To angles. To the exhaustion of a long career. But late at night, when the newsroom was dark and only the editors remained, Arthur would sometimes pull up the raw files. Just to look again. Because something in that photo felt wrong. And he wasn't the only one who thought so. One day, months later, a junior digital editor pulled Arthur aside. Whispered, "Hey, this might sound weird, but when I was color grading your photos from that day, I found something strange." Arthur's pulse quickened. The editor opened up the file, zoomed in to 400%, and there it was. A seam, running diagonally, barely noticeable under normal conditions, but clear as day when color enhanced and magnified. It cut across the side of the bundle, tracing a perfect line under what appeared to be an ear. Now, babies don't have seams, but dolls do, especially reborn dolls. Hyper-realistic, custom-painted, weighted to simulate the feel of an actual infant. Arthur stared at the screen in silence. Then he turned away, because once you accept the possibility, even for a second, that what you photographed wasn't real, you have to start asking questions no one wants to hear out loud. Like, why? And what exactly were we supposed to believe? He knew he couldn't publish the photo. Not that version. Not with the seams so visible. So it was cropped, lightened, adjusted, The final version that went to press showed only the glowing parents. The carefully wrapped bundle. The warmth. And yet, something inside him refused to let it go. So he did what he wasn't supposed to do. He started calling around. A contact in Palace Communications. A former staffer. A makeup artist who had worked with Meghan during her final trimester. Each of them said some version of the same thing. I can't talk about that. Or, let it be, Arthur. Or, more chillingly, you don't want to open that door. That last one stayed with him. Because Arthur had spent a career opening doors. Doors to palaces. To parades. To weddings and births and funerals. But this was different. This door didn't want to open, and the people around it didn't want it touched, which only made him more certain there was something behind it. And he wasn't alone. Because as whispers started circulating in the press corps, quietly, carefully, never on the record, other photographers began revisiting their files too. Some found nothing. But one, who had used a telephoto lens from a different angle, found something else entirely. A reflection. In a polished brass fixture behind Meghan, there was a subtle glint. A warped image, bent by the curve of metal. But when enhanced, it showed a version of the bundle that looked off. Too rigid. Too upright. As if it were being held not for comfort, but for display. Arthur stared at that image for a long time. He didn't say a word. But inside, something shifted. He knew he couldn't unsee it. And the worst part? He knew it was just the beginning. Because if that photo, that one historic image, had been manipulated, then what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. Why would anyone fake a baby? No, really, sit with that question. Not as a meme. Not as a throwaway joke about tabloids or internet rabbit holes. But as a serious, deeply uncomfortable inquiry. Because faking a baby is no small thing. It's not a wardrobe choice. It's not a PR misstep. It's not a lie you can explain away later as miscommunication. If you're going to hold a doll and tell the world it's your child, to smiling reporters, to millions watching live, to your own family, you're doing something calculated. Desperate, maybe, but certainly not accidental. And that's where this chapter starts. Not with the evidence, but with the question of motive. Because if Arthur Edwards, a man who has built his life on visual truth, now suspects the centerpiece of one of the most significant royal images in recent memory wasn't a living child, then we have to ask why anyone would take that risk. And risk is the right word. We're talking about a royal birth, a global media event, the Sussex's firstborn. There were expectations, traditions, protocols, the eyes of the entire world. You'd need a reason, a powerful one. So what was it? Let's rewind, not to the photo, but to the months leading up to it. At the time, Meghan Markle was already a lightning rod, loved by many, hated by others. The tabloid headlines were relentless, dissecting her outfits, her walk, her background, her family. Some attacks were cruel, racist, vicious. Others were more subtle, questioning her behavior, her relationships with staff, her decisions to break royal rules. But among all of that noise, one specific rumor kept bubbling to the surface. The pregnancy. People began noticing strange things. Inconsistencies. Photos taken just days apart showed her baby bump changing dramatically in size and shape. In some images, she was visibly pregnant. In others, seemingly flat-stomached, walking briskly in high heels, holding her coat tightly shut. No clear pattern. No logical timeline. But the palace said nothing. They didn't correct. They didn't confirm. And in that silence, speculation grew. Now, let's be careful here. Theories about fake pregnancies are nothing new. They've followed celebrities for decades, often unfairly. Some of them are fueled by misogyny, others by genuine curiosity.